Case of a missing young woman not seen in over 2 months. Heather Elvis, a cosmetology student, mysteriously vanished after arriving home from a date.
In the early morning of December 18, 2013, an officer doing a routine patrol by Peachtree Landing noticed an abandoned Dodge Intrepid. As the officer went down, it looked abandoned, but the officer didn't think anything of it then. There were no signs that the car had been broken into. The windows were rolled up and the vehicle was locked. Nobody was around. So the officers ran the plate and found the vehicle's owner, Terry Elvis. So the officers contacted Terry only to find out that the car was not in his use, but that of his daughter, 20-year-old Heather Elvis. Heather graduated from St. James High School in 2011. Independent from a young age, Heather charted her path. With her parents, Terry and Debbie, fully supporting her decision, she moved out of the family home to share an apartment with her best friend, Brianna Warlan. She dreamed of becoming a makeup artist and began pursuing her passion for cosmetology. She also worked as a waitress at the Tilted Kilt, a Scottish-themed restaurant in Myrtle Beach, to save up for her studies. The Myrtle Beach area of South Carolina was known for its beaches, golf, and over a mile of boardwalk. With a population of over 100,000 during the summer months, Myrtle Beach is a bustling transient area for many people. Amidst all of those great attractions and bustle, this delightful tourist spot isn't without its dark side. Heather was a free-spirited young woman who loved spending time with friends and children. She also loved her family, shared silly selfies, and was close with her siblings, especially her younger sister Morgan. Heather Elvis's bond with her father was nothing short of extraordinary. They exchanged daily text messages. By the time police contacted her dad, Heather had also not reached out to her parents, leaving them worried. Now that Heather's car had been found seemingly abandoned, they knew something was wrong. Her parents received a text from their daughter the night before her car was found. The text included a photo of Heather inside a different vehicle, saying she was learning to drive a stick shift. Thus, it was confirmed that she'd been with someone that night who was teaching her. Still, the question was, who? Upon investigation, it was discovered that the driving lesson was a date with Stephen Schiraldi, a former high school acquaintance. So the authorities wasted no time reaching out to him. He was a young man who was more like Heather's age. When interviewed by officers, he told them that he had gone on a date with Heather that night. She had gone to high school with him, and they ended up reconnecting on Instagram. They went out to dinner earlier that night, and he had dropped her off around 1 a.m. He also let the authorities look through his phone. A polygraph test was conducted, and he passed it. Police then spoke to Stephen Schiraldi's mother, who confirmed exactly what he'd said and got his phone records. Since Stephen's account did not lead investigators to Heather or provide them with much helpful information, they had to remove him as a suspect. With Stephen cleared as a suspect, investigators shifted their focus elsewhere while the community continued to rally around the Elvis family, determined to bring Heather home. On December 21st, the CUE Center for Missing Persons joined the search, bringing additional resources and expertise to the growing effort. The Elvis family launched the Find Heather Elvis Facebook page, which quickly garnered over 47,000 followers. In the early days, a $1,000 reward was offered for any information about Heather's disappearance. The next day, December 22nd, the First Baptist Church in Myrtle Beach hosted a heartfelt prayer vigil for Heather, drawing a large crowd of family, friends, and community members united in hope and prayer. By December 24th, the reward for information had increased to $10,000, reflecting the urgency and determination to find Heather. As New Year's Eve approached, Terry Elvis posted a sorrowful message on the Find Heather Elvis Facebook page, expressing the family's heartbreak as they faced the start of another year without answers. That same day, the reward for information rose to $20,000. By January 3, 2014, the reward reached $25,000, thanks to contributions from the Elvis family, friends, and the Tilted Kilt corporate offices. The Tilted Kilt also offered all its digital billboard advertising space to display Heather's missing person poster. In early January, Heather's case gained national attention when it was featured on Dateline NBC's Missing in America series. The episode shone a spotlight on Heather's story, drawing greater public awareness of her disappearance. As Heather's story reached a national audience, investigators intensified their efforts locally, turning their attention to those who knew her best. Her colleagues at the Tilted Kilt.
Restaurant when Sansone says a relationship developed between the two.
She was happy. I mean, she had a crush or, an affinity for him, and
They discovered another lead while doing so. While there, they talked with the manager, who immediately said, "You need to talk to Sydney Mora." So who was Sydney Mora? Sydney, 37, was a maintenance guy who handled whatever issues the restaurant had. A broken bathroom door, towels, anything that needed fixing. He was a local repairman who ran a small business called Palmetto Maintenance Company, fixing kitchen appliances in the Myrtle Beach area. He was married to Tammy Moore and had 3 children. How does a maintenance worker find himself at the center of a missing person investigation? To understand, we must go back to a bustling day at the Tilted Kilt. On that day, Heather Elvis worked her usual shift. The restaurant was bustling with people talking, dishes clinking, and orders being called out. Heather quickly moved through it, taking orders, clearing tables, and chatting with the customers. She had a way of making everyone feel welcome. During her shift, Heather carried a tray into the kitchen and accidentally bumped into a man named Sydney Mora. At first, it was just a casual meeting. Heather and Sydney started talking, as she often did with people she met at work. But this conversation would turn out to be different. It was the start of something that would change Heather's life forever. After meeting Sydney Mora, Heather Elvis was swept up in a whirlwind of emotions. She was instantly drawn to the older man, her feelings spilling onto social media. Using her Twitter account, Moonchild Heather, she began hinting at her growing infatuation, posting, "I got a taste for men who are older." Over time, her posts became more suggestive, with one caption directed at "the guy who builds things at my job." It wasn't long before she pointed Sydney out to her friends and co-workers, telling them, "That's the guy." Sydney, who seemed to enjoy the attention, began frequently appearing at the Tilted Kilt. He'd turn up even when he wasn't working, chatting with Heather in the kitchen and often making her laugh. By July, their relationship appeared to have moved beyond flirtation. Heather's tweets grew more pointed, with one reading, "Baby did a bad thing," followed a minute later by, "I'm in way too deep, but watch me get deeper." As their connection deepened, it became the talk of the restaurant. Co-workers noticed how Heather lit up around Sydney and how he started bringing her coffee and bagels on his days off, sometimes waiting for her outside in his vehicle. The rumors of their affair spread, and co-workers teased Heather about her involvement with a married man. Heather was often the target of mocking remarks and name-calling from others. On one occasion, 2 co-workers prank-called the restaurant, pretending to be Tammy, Sydney's wife. By August, the relationship was no longer a secret. Sydney openly discussed the affair with friends and even hinted at plans with Heather. He told some that he was considering hiring her as a nanny for his children if he and Tammy moved to Florida. The affair was intense. Sydney texted Heather frequently, often meeting her in secluded spots to continue their relationship. He told her he was unhappy and planned to leave his wife, but never followed through. Heather's friends grew concerned, warning her that Sydney was likely stringing her. The affair unfolded with increasing intensity from July 2013 to late October or early November 2013. Throughout the months of their affair, Sydney and Heather were in constant communication, exchanging 400 to 500 messages a month via their cell phones. Their connection thrived in secrecy, hidden from Tammy Mora, Sydney's wife. But the discovery of their affair would bring everything crashing down. By mid-September, the weight of secrecy and unfulfilled promises began to wear on Heather. On September 21st, she tweeted a cryptic message hinting at the strain the relationship had caused. Once upon a time, an angel and a devil fell in love. It did not end well. Around this time, it's believed that Heather may have tried to end the affair, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. For Heather, what had started as excitement and affection turned into a consuming emotional roller coaster, one she may have been desperate to escape. The toxic affair between Heather Elvis and Sydney Mora took an even darker turn when Sydney's wife, Tammy Mora, discovered the relationship. What followed was a confrontation that would scar Heather deeply. By early November 2013, Tammy became aware of her husband's betrayal. Her reaction wasn't confined to words. It left an indelible mark on the lives of everyone involved. Tammy Mora was known for her strong-willed and determined personality. She had a business license to run a travel agency out of her home, which aligned with the family's love for travel. However, a relative shared that much of the Mora family's income didn't come from traditional work. Instead, it reportedly came from lawsuits and settlements. This relative mentioned that Tammy and Sydney were open about their financial gains and often used the money to take trips, including frequent visits to Disneyland. Tammy's practicality and focus on financial stability were key to her personality. These traits and her reaction to discovering Sydney's affair became central to what unfolded in the following months. Tammy's housemate recounted the phone call she overheard. Enraged and deeply hurt, Tammy called Heather directly and humiliated her. She accused Heather of being nothing more than a fling for Sydney, coldly stating that he had just used her as a booty call. But Tammy didn't stop there. She forced Sydney to confront Heather on the phone as well. What should have been a moment of accountability became another cruel blow. According to Brianna, Sydney shouted at Heather, "You were nothing to me. You were just someone who spread your legs." The words were devastating, tearing apart Heather's self-esteem. Brianna later told investigators they tore Heather apart as a human being and who she was as a person. They made her feel horrible about herself. While Tammy expressed her feelings for her husband, on the contrary, Tammy and Sydney's marriage, as those around them would describe it, was far from healthy. It was a relationship steeped in control and volatility. Tammy appeared to hold immense power over Sydney, and their dynamic was riddled with anger, jealousy, and manipulation. What might have been a private conflict between a husband and wife quickly spiraled into a nightmare for Heather. This confrontation marked a pivotal moment, leaving Heather feeling broken and humiliated. Yet, rather than ending the affair, the toxicity only escalated, laying the groundwork for even more troubling events. At first glance, a look into Sydney Mora's life suggested that everything appeared normal. Tammy's anger manifested in relentless attacks on Heather Elvis, including phone calls, texts, and disparaging comments posted on social media. Those close to Heather described Tammy's behavior as relentless and deeply personal. Tammy was relentless. She would call Heather non-stop for hours. She would call using Sydney's phone and send Heather pictures and videos of her and Sydney performing sexual acts. It was meant to taunt Heather. She even contacted Heather's workplace and tried to get her fired. The constant harassment left Heather deeply shaken.
Now, let me ask you something. During the time this relationship was going on and he was bringing her coffee, he was bringing her bagels, coming to see him, even when he wasn't working, did at some point that relationship end?
It did.
Tell me about that.
It was mid to late October. I came into work and Heather was freaking out. She was very distraught, nervous. Found out later that two of the girls had played a prank phone call to work saying that it was Mrs. Moore and that she had found out that her and Sydney were having an affair. So she wanted to leave, we let her leave. After that, she said that there was no relationship and they had broken up.
And about when did that happen?
It was late October, early November.
Her manager at the Tilted Kilt, Jessica Cook, said Heather was genuinely scared of Tammy. Coupled with the heartbreak from her breakup with Sydney, the emotional toll was overwhelming.
Yes, your son, was she afraid of Sydney's wife, Tammy?
Yes.
Then, communication between Heather and the Moras had finally stopped. Heather focused on rebuilding her life, leaving Sydney and the drama behind. A friend, Deborah Woods, recalled that Heather was looking forward to her future again. She was starting to rediscover her optimism and work toward her envisioned life. On November 19, 2013, Sydney Mora, his wife Tammy, and their children left South Carolina for a family vacation to Disneyland. Tammy, known for loving everything Mickey Mouse, was thrilled to visit the iconic theme park. The family spent nearly 3 weeks away, returning home on December 11th. During their trip, the Moras focused on repairing their marriage, which Sydney's affair with Heather Elvis had deeply strained. They traveled in a new black Ford F-150 to mark a fresh start, a recent purchase that symbolized their attempt to move forward as a family. The road trip to California was seen as a step toward reconciliation, But beneath the surface, unresolved tensions simmered, tensions that would later come to light. Meanwhile, Heather Elvis appeared to be turning a new page in her life. She had recently started a job at a beauty parlor, taking a step closer to her dream of a career in cosmetology. She also found solace in routine, regularly attending church with her best friend and roommate, Brianna, as she began building a new chapter for herself. By all accounts, Heather seemed hopeful and grounded, ready to embrace the future ahead. But beneath the surface, life's complexities were quietly unfolding, setting the stage for the heartbreaking events yet to come. On the evening of December 17, 2013, 2 months after her relationship with Sydney Mora ended, Heather took a significant step forward. A fresh start after the troubling chapter with Sydney, she planned to go on a date with Stephen Schiraldi, a former schoolmate of Heather. Brianna Worrellman, Heather's best friend and roommate, was out of town that night but recalls discussing the date with Heather. It was supposed to be her first official date since her relationship with Sydney had ended. Heather sounded excited as she expressed how much she looked forward to the evening. Heather and Stephen spent the night driving around Myrtle Beach, enjoying the festive glow of Christmas lights. As mentioned earlier, Heather even sent messages to her father and Brianna, sharing her excitement about learning to drive Stephen's manual car. Later, Stephen dropped Heather off at her apartment around 1 a.m. the following day. Shortly after, Heather called Brianna, sounding emotional. Heather told her that Sydney had called her unexpectedly. According to Heather, Sydney claimed he had left his wife, missed her, and wanted to see her. These were Heather's last whereabouts and movements, and after that, she vanished. Police continued searching for Heather, combing through wooded areas in Horry County for any sign of the missing woman. They made a grim discovery during their efforts, not once, but twice within the same week. The first set of skeletal remains was uncovered on Saturday, December 28th, along Tidewater Road. Preliminary analysis from an anthropologist suggested the remains belonged to a young man, likely in his 20s. The coroner confirmed they were human, and larger bones were immediately sent to a lab in Texas for DNA testing in hopes of determining if they were connected to any local missing persons cases. Investigators believed the remains had been in the area for several years. Scattered across a 100-yard stretch of the forest, the bones appeared to have been moved by animals. Despite the discovery, police pressed on, determined to find more clues related to Heather's disappearance. Days later, on New Year's Day, a second set of remains was found near Ronald McNair Boulevard, not far from the first site. These remains did not form a complete skeleton, but authorities suspect they could belong to the same individual. An anthropologist working on the case analyzed the evidence to confirm this possibility. No personal items or clothing were found with the remains, leaving investigators without immediate leads for identification. Despite the grim discoveries of human remains, none of them were linked to Heather, leaving her family and investigators desperate for answers. As police pursued every lead, attention turned to those who had been part of Heather's life in the months leading up to her disappearance. One name kept surfacing: Sydney Mora. On December 20th, just days after Heather vanished, police contacted Mora, marking a critical shift in the investigation. What initially seemed like a missing persons case began unraveling into a web of deceit, suspicion, and unsettling revelations about Heather's final hours. As the investigation into Heather Elvis's disappearance unfolded, Sydney Mora maintained his distance, attempting to downplay any connection to her. During questioning, Mora dismissed the relationship, saying, "Look, I'm over her. I haven't reached out to her. I don't know where she is. I had zero contact with her." Mora also denied being near Peachtree Landing, where Heather's car was found abandoned. However, his assertions raised more questions than answers for investigators. Meanwhile, Heather's parents, Terry and Debbie Elvis, were doing everything they could to bring attention to their daughter's disappearance. They appeared on local news stations, pleading for Heather's safe return and sharing details about her case. The car showed no sign of a struggle, no blood or broken glass. At first glance, Heather Elvis's abandoned car at Peachtree Landing offered little evidence to suggest foul play. But the pivotal point came as investigators dug deeper into Heather's phone records. A puzzling discovery shifted their perspective. They found a series of unusual calls that took place in the early hours of December 18th, hours before Heather's car was reported to the police. The calls began around 1:35 a.m. and involved incoming and outgoing connections to a payphone, a number she had no prior connection to. The pattern of activity raised questions, as payphone calls were uncommon and stood out against the backdrop of Heather's typical communication habits. Heather dialed that payphone back 9 times in a short period. Horry County Assistant Solicitor Chris Helms later explained the significance. The only reason she could be calling that phone 9 times, that phone she's never heard of before, is to get the other person that just talked back on the line. Heather called the payphone twice from her apartment. At 2:32 a.m., she changed into her favorite outfit and left her apartment. Cell phone records show she made another call to the payphone while driving. At 2:43 a.m., she arrived in the same area where Sidney and his wife, Tammy Mora, had been just hours earlier. Heather called the payphone 6 more times after arriving, but none of her calls were answered. Heather eventually returned home. At 3:16 and 3:17 a.m., she tried calling Sidney's cell phone twice. The first call went to voicemail, but the second lasted a little over 4 minutes. Sidney's location data shows he was at or near his home during this call. Shortly after, Heather left her apartment again and drove to Peachtree Landing, a secluded spot about 5 minutes from the Moras' home. While at Peachtree Landing, Heather tried calling Sidney's cell phone 4 more times, at 3:38, 3:39, 3:40 and 3:41 a.m. Each call went straight to voicemail. The 3:41 a.m. call was the last activity ever recorded from Heather's phone. Since that moment, there had been no further sign of Heather. Cell phone records reveal that the couple, who had regularly communicated during the affair, abruptly stopped speaking to each other from November 2, 2013 to December 18, 2013. At 4:37 a.m., Tammy Mora texted Sidney, their first communication since November 2, 2013. The investigation revealed another strange detail: calls from Heather Elvis to Sidney Mora's phone in the early hours of December 18, 2013. After months of silence between them, these calls were unusual for Heather. Meanwhile, police examined grainy surveillance footage linked to Heather's phone records from the payphone. The video showed a man approaching the payphone, but the image quality was too poor to identify him. Despite this, the suspicious activity was enough for investigators to bring Sidney Mora back to the station for further questioning. The payphone footage and the unexpected calls between Heather and Sidney became critical threads in the investigation, hinting at a possible connection between Sidney and the events leading to Heather's disappearance. When questioned by police, Sidney Mora claimed that he and Tammy had been running errands the night of December 17th, including a stop at Walmart to purchase a pregnancy test for Tammy. His account of the night was inconsistent and quickly began to unravel.
This is Sidney Mora, on camera in a Walmart, buying a pregnancy test the night Heather Elvis disappeared in December 2013. It's a scene that would be played over and over again in court for the next 6 years, but always hidden from the public's view.
Police also asked Sidney about the payphone call linked to Heather Elvis. Initially, he denied making the call and even questioned whether payphones were still in use. But when confronted with surveillance footage showing someone using the payphone, Sidney admitted to calling Heather. He claimed he had told her to please leave me alone. The conflicting statements, suspicious phone activity, and Heather's unexplained presence at Peachtree Landing painted a puzzling picture, heightening concerns about what happened to her in those early hours of December 18th. However, Heather Elvis's former roommate, Brianna Worrellman, revealed that she had received a phone call from Heather early that morning. She was hysterically crying, Brianna recalled, and she said, "Sidney called me. My heart dropped because I was like, I thought we were past this." Concerned, Brianna asked Heather why she had answered the call. Heather explained that it wasn't Sidney's usual number. "She told me that he said he left his wife, was sorry, and wanted to see her and be with her," Brianna continued. "And I told her, don't do it. Why don't you go to sleep? Sleep on this, and we'll talk about it first thing in the morning."
My exact words were, "Do not call Sidney back. Don't do anything rash. Go to sleep and we'll talk about it tomorrow."
Heather referred to the call at 1:35 a.m. when Sidney contacted her for the first time in 6 weeks. Brianna Worrellman told police she genuinely believed that Heather Elvis had decided not to meet with Sidney Mora that night. After their emotional phone call, Brianna had managed to calm Heather down, urging her to sleep on it and promising they would talk in the morning. However, what unfolded next contradicted Brianna's hopes and deepened the mystery. Despite her friend's advice, Heather appeared to have acted on impulse. Location data from Sydney's phone showed that Sydney was at or near his home when he called Heather. At the same time, location data from Heather's phone showed that shortly after the call, she left her apartment and drove to Peachtree Landing. The 3:41 a.m. phone call was the last call made from Heather's phone, and then the phone went dead. Just minutes after Heather Elvis's phone went silent, the long-standing silence between Sydney and Tammy Mora ended. At 4:37 a.m. on December 18, 2013, Tammy sent Sydney a text message, the first direct communication between the couple since November 2, 2013. Police also began working on gathering CCTV footage of nearby areas. During their investigation, Horry County Police focused on locating a black truck captured on surveillance footage heading toward Peachtree Landing in the early hours of December 18, 2013. Detective Livesey noted that Sydney Mora was the only individual living near the landing who owned a truck matching the one seen in the footage. The same surveillance cameras that captured the truck heading toward the landing also recorded it returning in the opposite direction at 3:45 a.m., just 5 minutes after Heather Elvis's final call to Sydney Mora's cell phone. This critical detail linked Sydney's truck to the location and timing of Heather's disappearance, raising serious questions about his and Tammy Mora's involvement. On December 20, 2013, police visited the Mora's home as part of their investigation into Heather Elvis's disappearance. Tammy Mora gave officers consent to enter the property, where several notable items were discovered. The Moras had a home surveillance system, a black 2013 Ford F-150 Platinum truck that Tammy claimed could not be unlocked at the time, and a pile of suspicious items near their camper, including a bag of cement, a spent shotgun shell, and a bottle of cleaning fluid. The visit appeared to prompt swift action from the Moras. The very next day, Sydney Mora purchased a new home surveillance system. Footage from this system later showed Sydney, Tammy's sister, and Tammy's sister's boyfriend meticulously cleaning, pressure washing, and vacuuming the black Ford F-150 on December 22, 2013. After the cleaning, the group burned the rags used in the process, raising further suspicion. On the morning of February 21 at 7:30 a.m., police executed a search warrant at the residence of Sydney and Tammy Mora as part of the ongoing investigation into Heather Elvis's disappearance. The warrant also extended to the Mora's truck, a key piece of evidence investigators hoped would shed light on the case. Sydney and Tammy were taken into custody during the search. As investigators examined the truck, they discovered its fully loaded GPS navigation system had been disengaged. It was determined through the investigation that the system could be manually disabled, a step that had only been taken once on the night Heather Elvis went missing. This critical detail raised further suspicions, as the deliberate action suggested an attempt to conceal movements during that crucial time frame. On February 21 at 8:50 a.m., Tammy Mora was booked into the J. Reuben Long Detention Center, followed by Sydney Mora at 11 a.m. The arrests followed an intense investigation into Heather Elvis's disappearance, and both individuals were held as authorities continued building their case. By February 22, Sydney and Tammy Mora faced separate bond hearings, each charged with obstruction of justice and 2 counts of indecent exposure. A hold was placed on their release, as officials indicated more charges were likely. Shortly after, the Horry County Police Department announced 6 arrest warrants for the couple, including charges of obstruction of justice, indecent exposure, kidnapping, and murder in connection to Heather Elvis's disappearance. Despite the lack of direct physical evidence, investigators pressed forward, confident they had uncovered key elements pointing to the Mora's involvement. By April 2014, 4 months had passed since Heather Elvis disappeared. In the midst of the ongoing uncertainty, the community came together in a remarkable show of support. Dozens of volunteers worked to revitalize Peachtree Boat Landing, transforming the once somber location into a place of remembrance and hope. The effort included repaving the landing, planting flowers, and adding meaningful trinkets throughout the area. Among these was a wind chime featuring a sun and moon, a symbol that held special significance for Heather's family. On January 30th, 2015, a Charleston judge set a bond for Sydney and Tammy Mora at $100,000 each for all charges connected to Heather Elvis's case. As part of the bond conditions, the judge required both to wear GPS monitoring devices, stay outside a 5-mile radius of the Elvis family home, and refrain from contacting the family. That evening, Sydney and Tammy Mora were transported back to J. Reuben Long Detention Center in Horry County. Later that night, Tammy Mora posted bond and was released. A few days later, on February 2nd, 2015, Sydney Mora also posted a bond and was released from the detention center, continuing to face strict monitoring as the investigation and legal proceedings moved forward. On March 10, 2016, murder charges against Sydney and Tammy Mora were dropped, while kidnapping charges remained pending. Additionally, the indecent exposure charges against both were dismissed. Tammy's obstruction of justice charge was also dropped, but Sydney's charge for the same offense was upheld. The decision to drop the murder charges reflected the significant challenges faced by the prosecution. With no physical evidence, no body, no blood, and no murder weapon, it would have been nearly impossible to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Without direct evidence tying the Moras to Heather's death, the case hinged on circumstantial evidence, making it an uphill battle for the state to secure a conviction on that charge. On June 20, 2016, Sydney Mora's trial for the kidnapping of Heather Elvis began with jury selection. The trial lasted 5 days, capturing significant public attention. However, on July 29, 2016, during the second day of his trial, Sydney violated the gag order by speaking to a local media outlet. A judge sentenced him to 5 months in jail for the violation, and he was immediately incarcerated. 2 months later, on September 28, 2016, Sydney was released early for his breach of the gag order. On August 30, 2017, Sydney faced a separate trial, where a jury found him guilty of obstruction of justice for impeding the investigation into Heather Elvis's disappearance. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. In a significant development on October 23, 2018, a jury found Tammy Mora guilty of kidnapping and conspiracy to commit kidnapping in connection with Heather's disappearance. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison for each charge, with the sentences to run concurrently. 1 month later, on November 27, 2018, the parole board denied Sydney Mora's request for parole. This decision came more than a year after his conviction for obstructing the investigation, ensuring he remained incarcerated. On June 20, 2016, Sydney Mora's trial for the kidnapping of Heather Elvis began with jury selection. The trial, which lasted 5 days, attracted significant public attention as prosecutors laid out their case. During the trial, prosecutors began to explore a potential motive for Heather's disappearance, delving into Tammy Mora's anger over Sydney's affair with Heather. Testimony from Heather's co-workers at the Tilted Kilt revealed that she had taken a pregnancy test at work in early November 2013 after noticing weight gain. At the time, Heather was reportedly not involved with anyone other than Sydney. However, the test results came back with an error, leaving the possibility of a pregnancy unresolved. Prosecutors suggested that this uncertainty could have fueled Tammy's rage and served as a motive for Heather's disappearance. They argued that a pregnancy test Sydney purchased at Walmart on the night of Heather's disappearance might not have been for Tammy, as claimed, but instead for Heather. If she was pregnant, I think that would be another reason why Tammy would want Heather out of the picture, a detective speculated, pointing to Tammy's anger and the couple's actions as evidence of a coordinated plan to confront or harm Heather. Despite this compelling narrative, Sydney's defense attorney, Kirk Truslow, argued that the case relied on circumstantial evidence. There was a bunch of bad character evidence and a tremendous amount of circumstantial evidence, he stated, emphasizing the lack of direct proof tying Sydney or Tammy to Heather's disappearance. After the mistrial in Sydney Mora's kidnapping case in July 2016, the search for justice for Heather Elvis remained unresolved. As the legal process continued, the emotional weight of her disappearance lingered deeply within her family and the community. In December 2016, a vigil was held in Heather's honor, bringing together family, friends, and supporters to remember and keep her story alive. The event served as a powerful reminder of the love and hope surrounding Heather, even as the answers about her fate remained elusive. As the trial continued, the jury deliberated for 2 days, ultimately spending about 8 hours trying to reach a verdict. However, they were unable to come to a unanimous decision. The judge declared a mistrial, leaving the kidnapping case unresolved and setting the stage for a retrial.
Family and friends held a candlelight vigil to remember Heather Elvis. It happened Sunday night. The Horry County woman now missing for 3 years. And the vigil was held at Peachtree Landing, which is where Elvis's car was found. The event also honored other people who've disappeared. Elvis's parents say the holidays are the toughest, and the gatherings like this help them work through their grief.
It's important that we do it every year because every year somebody has lost somebody right before Christmas. Every year somebody's struggling.
In August 2017, Sydney faced a separate trial on charges of obstruction of justice. This charge stemmed from his initial denial to police about making the call to Heather from a payphone, a call that prosecutors argued was central to luring Heather to Peachtree Landing. Surveillance footage contradicted Sydney's denial, and the jury took just 50 minutes to find him guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, marking a significant development in the long and complex investigation.
Indictment number 2014 GS 261125, State of South Carolina, County of Horry versus Sydney St. Clair Moore. We, the jury, by unanimous consent, find the defendant, Sydney St. Clair Moore, on the charge of kidnapping, guilty. Indictment number 2018 GS 263067, State of South Carolina, County of Horry versus Sydney St. Clair Moore. We, the jury, by unanimous consent, find the defendant, Sydney St. Clair Moore, on the charge of conspiracy to kidnap, guilty. Dated September 18th, 2019, signed by foreperson Wanda Sims. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if this is your verdict, so signify by raising your right hand. Thank you.
While the mistrial in the kidnapping case left many unanswered questions, the obstruction conviction provided a measure of accountability. It was a step forward, though it fell short of providing closure for Heather's family and the community still seeking justice for her disappearance. On October 23, 2018, a jury found Tammy Mora guilty of kidnapping and conspiracy to commit kidnapping in connection with Heather Elvis's disappearance. She was sentenced to 2 concurrent 30-year prison terms. Prosecutors had added the conspiracy charge after re-examining evidence, recognizing the challenges of Tammy's trial compared to Sydney's. Unlike Sydney, there was no direct video or phone evidence linking Tammy to the crime. To build their case, prosecutors presented the Mora's phone records and a pattern of disturbing behavior in the months following Heather's breakup with Sydney. Evidence suggested that Tammy's fury over the affair motivated coordinated actions against Heather. After Tammy found out about this affair, they stalked Heather Elvis, a prosecutor argued. During the trial, Tammy was portrayed as a dominant and controlling figure. Prosecutors presented evidence of Tammy's attempts to assert control over Sydney, including taking his phone, forbidding him from working at the Tilted Kilt, and even allegedly handcuffing him to their bed at night to prevent him from leaving. Testimony revealed Tammy demanded Sydney get a tattoo of her name on his lower abdomen as punishment. Although Sydney's defense argued the tattoo predated Heather's disappearance, testimony from witnesses cast doubt on that claim. Prosecutors also introduced forensic evidence linking the Moras to Heather's disappearance. Surveillance footage showed a dark pickup truck matching the Moras' Ford F-150, heading toward and returning from Peachtree Landing the night Heather vanished. Cell tower data further placed Tammy and Sydney's phones near Heather's locations after their breakup and near the payphone Sydney used to call Heather. Tammy decided to testify in her defense, a move that added tension to the trial. While she initially came across as credible, cross-examination revealed inconsistencies. Tammy admitted to sending angry texts after discovering the affair, but claimed her anger was directed at Sydney for lying, not at Heather. However, her defensive and combative demeanor on the stand left jurors questioning her credibility. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Tammy of both kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap. The verdict brought relief to some, but frustration to others, as Heather's fate remained unresolved. One day after Tammy Mora was found guilty of kidnapping in connection with Heather Elvis's disappearance, the case took another dramatic turn. That day, the judge found Terry Elvis, Heather's father, guilty of contempt of court. The charge stemmed from statements Terry reportedly made to the defense attorney during Tammy's trial. The judge ordered him to pay a $400 fine by noon or face 30 days in jail. This moment illustrated the raw emotions that ran through the courtroom as Heather's family continued to seek justice while enduring the weight of their loss. In September 2019, Sydney Mora's retrial for kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap began. Prosecutors presented compelling new evidence, including testimony from Tammy's cousin, who claimed Sydney had shown him a photo of Heather appearing deceased. Surveillance footage of Sydney cleaning and burning rags used on the Mora's truck after Heather's disappearance was also introduced, painting a damning picture of suspicious behavior. Despite the defense arguments that the case relied on circumstantial evidence, the jury took just 2 hours to convict Sydney of kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap. Like Tammy, he received 2 concurrent 30-year prison terms. For the Elvis family, the verdicts against Tammy and Sydney Mora offered limited solace. While justice had been served in part, the lingering uncertainty about Heather's fate continued to weigh heavily. Family friend Hope Larson captured the collective sentiment. The emotions that everyone felt were empty. There was no reprieve from the heaviness because we don't know where Heather is. Heather's younger sister, Morgan Elvis, held out hope that Sydney, who she believed once cared deeply for Heather, might one day reveal the truth. Her father, Terry Elvis, continued to grapple with the painful reality of her disappearance. "I hold out hope that I'll turn around one day at the front door, and she'll walk in," he shared, though he admitted, deep down, "No, I don't, but I'll never give up." The Elvis family remains steadfast in their pursuit of closure, longing for answers and the truth about what happened to Heather Elvis, a mystery that continues to haunt them and the community. Heather Elvis vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving her loved ones searching for answers. Similarly, Carrie Farver, a talented programmer and devoted mother, disappeared without a trace. Yet her story took an even more baffling turn as she seemed to continue texting from beyond the grave. How did these seemingly ordinary lives unravel into extraordinary tales of obsession and deception? Click on the next video to uncover the chilling twists that solved Carrie Farver's case.